everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm delighted to be speaking with sports psychologist and coach developer, Dr Amy Whitehead. Amy, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks Dan, thanks for inviting me on.
Really excited to have you on. Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm a reader in sports psychology and coaching at Liverpool John Moores University. I've been there for 5 years. I kind of specialise in the Think Aloud protocol, which we'll talk about today, and I work across the sports coaching and sports psychology programs at LJMU.
As you said, we're going to be talking about something called the Think Aloud protocol, which I'm really excited to talk about because it's really meaningful to me. So why don't we start with you taking us through what the Think Aloud protocol is, and maybe you'll do that by, just take us back to the beginning of you using this methodology.
Yeah, of course. So Think Aloud's kind of been used from as early as 1920. A piece of research by Watson looks at how problem solving, basically he asked his colleagues to verbalise what they were thinking as they were problem solving a task. But it's the work is originated or kind of is more well known from Erickson and Simon's book from 1980 and 93, which the Verbal Reports as Data book. So basically Think Aloud is just verbalising what you're thinking as you're doing. And within a sports context, or within the context of my work, I mic'd up golfers, and as they play golf, I ask them to tell me what they're thinking as they're performing. So my PhD, which I finished in 2015, basically involved me following different types of golfers, kind of novices, more advanced golfers around the golf course, and asking them to verbalise everything they were thinking as they were playing. We looked at differences between practice and competition, we looked at differences between expertise, and we also tested the use of Think Aloud in terms of the kind of data that we get from it compared to retrospective measures. Because I think one of the first things that one of the first challenges for me using it as a data collection tool was, why is Think Aloud better or more applicable than retrospective methods of data collection? So I guess that's where it all started for me.
So stripping that back slightly, so Think Aloud protocol has been used since 1920, and Watson was that?
Yeah.
Watson, who was asking people to talk aloud in terms of what they were thinking whilst doing a task, and so this has been brought into a sporting landscape, or you brought it into a sporting landscape, getting participants, starting with golfers, to talk aloud in terms of what they're thinking about. And what I hear you say there is actually this could be a more accurate methodology to deliver us some data about thoughts, about cognitions, as we'd say in psychology, than retrospective interviews. So retrospective interviews being participants talking about what happened on the golf course a few hours ago, actually getting some data in the moment, recording that talk that they're having in the moment. Would I be right in saying what I've said?
Yeah, spot on, Dan. So the first piece of research that I ever did was to look at the content of this Think Aloud data and compare it to retrospective interviews at 24 hours and 48 hours, and also immediately after performance. Now, if you kind of look at I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, but he talks a lot about the memory experience gap. So depending on the outcome of the experience, very much depends on how we remember the event. And this was quite evident in one example on the golf course, where a golfer hit the ball, and I think he sliced it, and he was quite angry at himself. So his Think Aloud verbalizations were very negative. I won't swear, but they contained some swear words.
Yep.
But by the time he actually got to the ball, because he didn't see where it had landed, he got to it, and actually the lie of the ball was quite good. the lie was, it was good. He was able to chip onto the green, and the outcome and the overall score from that hole was not bad. I think he scored par, and he was relatively happy with the outcome. So when I asked him later on about that shot, can you talk me through it? What were you thinking? How are you feeling? He gave me quite positive responses. So actually, the data that I collected from Think Aloud and the data that I collected from this retrospective interview were very different, and that was because of the outcome and how he felt at the very end of that hole, of that process. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that although, retrospective interviews do have their place, and Think Aloud does have its limitations, it's an important method for us to capture these experiences and these thoughts and feelings as they're happening in the event.
It's really interesting to Kahneman and the memory experience gap. When you said that, I thought of Dan McAdams, who's a globally leading researcher into personality science, and he talks about autobiographical memory. When we reflect back on our lives and we create a narrative about our lives, how actually inconsistent that narrative is relative to what actually happened. He talks about autobiographical memory being exceptionally almost spurious, really. Just we create this narrative that's untrue.
Yeah. Well, and which was what happened in that exact case.
Yeah, and I suppose getting reliable data from that retrospective interview must be quite challenging. And it's funny, obviously, as you know, I was a professional golfer and golf coach before I became a sports psychologist, and I certainly remember slicing the ball a lot. I mainly hooked the ball left off of the planet, and I'm sure there were plenty of swear words. But it's really interesting. I'm sure you work as a sports psychologist with golfers, and so much of my work with golfers is helping them rationalise when I call them C and D shots. So I help golfers rationalise by saying, well, you've got A shots, B shots, C shots, D shots. Mm-hmm. And actually, golfers, what they do is they hit the C shot, not the D shot. The D shot is the really destructive shot, the one that goes miles right or miles left. The C shot is the one that goes, as you kind of described from this player, slightly off into, say, the rough, might find a good lie, but is berating him or herself for that C shot, for that slice or that slight hook, berating themselves. But actually, if they find a good lie, they hit a great approach shot, they might birdie or par the hole, and everything's sweetness and light. But actually in the moment, they haven't dealt very well with the first poor shot. Golfers never seem to be rational, and collecting that data in the moment, as you say, is really important. There must have been some interesting data coming through in terms of those thoughts that players were having.
Yeah, definitely. I think outside of the research, what some of this data give me or enabled me to see as a sports psychologist is how some players would react quite negatively to certain shots. It enabled me to see things like pre-performance routines, and whether if we'd discussed embedding pre-performance routines, if they're actually engaging in them or not. And you could start to see patterns emerging where if a pre-performance routine wasn't employed, that might then have a negative effect on the outcome of the shot. Similarly, I found quite a clear, with one player in particular, he had a lot of indecisiveness. So when he was indecisive, that would correlate more so with an unsuccessful or a less successful shot outcome. So because we were able to capture some of that thought process and that data, we were then able to look at, okay, how can we help him become more decisive or more confident in his decisions, and then similarly with other players, how can we make sure that they're sticking to these pre-performance routines, and then it gives them evidence as well of when they do stick to the routines, they are more positive or the outcomes are more successful. That's just a couple of examples of the kind of stuff we can get from this data, but I'm sure we'll come and talk about that a little bit more.
I've got a question on that. So did you get the players, the golfers, to talk through every routine on every shot? Is that what you did?
Not necessarily. The whole thing with Think Aloud is getting them to talk you through what they're thinking. And there's one thing I haven't said is there's different levels of Think Aloud. So from a research perspective, we use level 2 Think Aloud, which captures kind of what is in the short-term memory. So if you look at the kind of instructions that Erickson and Simon talk about, it's verbalizing everything that comes to mind at that particular time, but not to explain them thought processes. I've kind of taken that step further with some of the work I've done and some of the golfers that I'm working with, and I do ask them to explain. And that's because I want that extra level of information. From a kind of sports psych consultancy perspective, it's given me kind of the reasons why and why not, the kind of making certain decisions on the golf course. From a research perspective, there's limitations for asking for the explanations, because there's an argument that you were asking participants to retrieve information from the long-term memory, and then in turn it's not a natural thought process that we're capturing. Also, another limitation of that is we're potentially promoting overthinking. So we're promoting this metacognition of thinking about thinking, which could have a detrimental effect on performance.
Can you just coming back a little bit? You said 3 levels. Can you talked about level 2, I think. Can you go through those levels so we have an understanding?
Yeah, so level 1 is no instructions are given to the participant. So if we're using this from a research perspective, we put a microphone on a participant. So I'll put a microphone on you, Dan, you'll go and play golf, and we'll just capture what you're naturally kind of verbalizing. So if you might naturally miss a shot and, react in a way.
It won't be pretty. It won't be pretty, Amy, I can assure you. Sorry, carry on.
So the problem with that type of data capture is that we're not collecting kind of full sentences, we're not fully understanding, what's going on in your mind at the time. Level 2 is the more prominent method that's used, where again it's just asking participants to verbalize everything that comes to mind during the task. So that can be absolutely anything. So for example, when I'm working with golfers, they might talk about being hungry, or they might talk about what's on TV later on in the evening. It's anything that's coming to mind at the time. And then level 3 is kind of level 2, but with an extra layer of explaining the thought process. So again, a golfer stood in front of a ball, says, right, I'm going to use a 7-iron because I've got 120 yards, and then they'll talk through kind of the reasoning why. There's been a meta-analysis done by, I think it's Fox et al. 2011, that shows that level 2 Think Aloud doesn't disrupt performance, or shouldn't disrupt performance. Level 3 might disrupt performance because, again, we're asking participants to retrieve information from the long-term memory and potentially thinking more about the thinking.
I'm thinking from a practical perspective, because I hear that it can disrupt performance, but from a coach's perspective, this sounds like a really, really useful thing to do with golfers or participants in general. I know some sports, I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, some sports it will be more difficult, but golf obviously being slow, self-paced, plenty of time, you don't have to run around like a nutter, and you're not going to be clattered into by the opposition. You can attach a microphone and a recording instrument to you. I just see this as something that can be so useful for players to do, even just themselves, just recording what their thoughts are at any given time and explaining that thought process. And I understand that notion that the explanation of the thought process can be deemed to be overthinking, but from a training perspective, you could do it in competition. You could say, early in the season, I'm going to do this. It could be a mini tour event, a small competition or something, just to give yourself some feedback, just to improve your metacognition, your thinking about your thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I have used it as an applied tool. I've worked with coaches who've then applied it and used it with their golfer. And a project I've just completed with a colleague down in Chichester is where we've looked at how and what a golfer can get from this using Think Aloud. So we've looked at, we've mic'd the golfer up, we've asked them to use Think Aloud as they play, and then we've interviewed them afterwards to ask them, well, what have you learned about yourself during that process? We also advocate that they will then listen back to that audio. So they're not only just kind of getting the immediate feedback and reflections of their own thought processes during performance, but then they're listening back. And kind of getting that double level of reflection. So you've got your reflection in action and your reflection on the action, which was in the action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. No, look, I mean, I'm sure you got some with your research with with your colleague down in Chichester. I'm sure you got some really interesting data, but I can assure you, I suppose this is my opinion, but as a former professional player, I just think that to me is imperative. That to me is imperative because it's helping me become more aware of what I'm thinking at a time when I can sit down after the event and listen to myself and listen with a rational mind. Because so often, as much as I myself, you and other sports psychologists and coaches are striving to help competitors compete in more of a rational state, it is an enormous challenge, and being able to sit down in the comfort of your armchair and reflect back, listen to yourself and reflect back, I think is so vital. I could talk about that all day long, but I know you've done some really interesting stuff in endurance sport, specifically cycling time trials. Can we talk a little bit about that experiment?
Yeah, of course. So we've done a few studies now in cycling, and I think one of the motives for this was I've started to take up cycling myself. So awesome. There's a bit of a theme going on with my research where I start a new sport and then I think, right, could we use Think Aloud in this sport? Anyway, so I originally, a lot of the kind of literature and academics that I was speaking to would often say that it's impossible to capture Think Aloud in certain environments because, one, it could be distracting. I even got told it would be too dangerous and a cyclist might fall off their bike. So I guess the early work was just to test whether it was physically possible to capture Think Aloud data within cycling. So we ran a few pilot studies, and we were capturing some really interesting data from these cyclists. And if you look at a lot of the cycling data, it's very lab-based. Cycling research, it's very lab-based. It lacks ecological validity, and I was very fortunate at the time to do in the first study that I was working with a colleague who was part of a cycling club. So again, we looked at doing a preliminary exploratory study where we mic'd up cyclists in a real-life 10-mile time trial, and just to look at what is it that they're focusing on and thinking about during an event. And we found some really interesting evidence that links with previous theories of endurance around we looked at pacing. So how do people pace? When do they increase speed? When do they reduce it? And what cognitive that will affect kind of the output? And we found, differences between experts and novices as well. So in terms of the pacing curve, I don't know if you're an endurance athlete, Dan, but most novices.
If you saw me, you'd know I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm reasonably fit, but I'm not an endurance athlete. I can assure you.
So a lot of novices, they start off quick, dip in the middle, and then when they know they've only got half a mile left, then they'll speed up again. And also, novices will verbalise a lot of distractive thoughts, so they dissociate from the event. They try and ignore the pain, forget about it, think about other things. Whereas more elite cyclists will be completely aware of their feelings, completely aware of the pain that they might be experiencing, but they're more comfortable with that. So they will associate a lot more. And outside of the research, I started looking into running, not similar to Noel Brick's work. And we haven't published this, but I was working with one athlete, and what we noticed with her is as soon as she started to dissociate and kind of distract herself from the pain, her pace would drop significantly. So again, from an applied perspective, you've got some real kind of simple ways there to help athletes improve kind of performance by keeping them thinking about the task at hand. That's more from an elite perspective. Again, with novices, you might want to keep them dissociated or distracted, which will help them kind of persevere. Sorry, I'm kind of going in different directions there.
That's absolutely fantastic. I mean, the big thing I've got lots out of that, and just to say to the Sports Psych Show audience, we're talking about endurance performance here. Episode number 62, Dr. Carla Mayen, and it was a fantastic episode on self-talk strategies, and you mentioned there, Amy, Dr. Noel Brick, who I interviewed in episode number 85, and we talked for a good hour on these kind of strategies, which I think are vital. And I got lots from what you were saying there, and the one thing I was thinking about, the really important thing if we're talking about performance here, performance enhancement, is being able to measure the data, the cognitive data in action seems vital to me, because you can relate it to outcomes, you can relate it to performance, can't you?
Yeah.
Getting back this data is, I was thinking, obviously in the moment, I'm trying to think of some cognitions that they might have. Oh, my knee's hurting. I'm trying to breathe through this now. Keep pushing, keep going. You can relate some of the strategies that they're doing to the outcome of whether that's the time, whether that's the position in the race, etc., etc. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, so exactly that. We collected power output data, heart rate data, speed data, etc., and then we could look at the relationships between certain cognitions that were being verbalized and where there was a dip in kind of performance. And I think, again, from an applied perspective, if you're working with an individual athlete and you're able to use this, then you can track their thought processes and their performance over time. So I've actually got a master's student currently, just finishing off his research, where he's used Think Aloud on himself over 12 weeks. He's a cyclist. He's a triathlete, but he's used it in cycling, and he's looking at how Think Aloud, because it's kind of twofold. Has Think Aloud altered the way he thinks about performance? And also, what is he thinking during performance? So he's got his heart rate data, he's got his power output, and he can see things like where he's thinking certain thoughts, where his maybe performance might be dropping, or where he's thinking certain thoughts, his performance might be increasing or improving. And then also Think Aloud's enabled him to become a little bit more focused on his sessions every single week, because he's kind of more clear about, what's the objective of the session and how are my thoughts going to link to me succeeding in this session today. So he's still writing that up, but that's been a really interesting kind of project for me as an observer, to kind of be his critical friend and hear about his use of that over the 12 weeks, because no one's ever applied Think Aloud with a single performer over that duration of time.
It's amazing that hasn't happened. I mean, I'm just looking at this paper, the cycling paper here, and you've mentioned some of the themes that you were measuring, internal sensory monitoring, so that's a secondary theme, and a primary theme within internal sensory monitoring: breathing, pain and discomfort, hydration, fatigue, temperature, heart rate, and then examples of the raw data quotes. So with breathing, there's some cognition here, pretty smooth. Just keep the deep breaths, controlling my breathing, breathe in and breathe out. Something on hydration here, going to use this opportunity to get a drink, thirsty again. Something on heart rate. Heart rate's at 94 already. Pulse is rising to 170. Bear with me here because I just want to go through this because I think this is really interesting. A secondary theme, active self-regulation. Primary theme, speed. Someone said speed is still down a bit, kilometres still over 30, that's good. Watts below 300, bring the power down a touch. Definitely got less power at this point. That was going into power. The point being is I think sometimes whether it's this fan or supporter, whether it's the layperson, or even some branches, if I may say, of coaching and psychology can say, well, it's about not thinking. These people don't think. When they're at their best, they don't think at all. Now, there is absolutely the notion of overthinking. I don't think anybody can deny that. But I'm a big advocate I'm certainly not an advocate of, clear your mind and think of nothing. Even in team invasion sports that are very quick, that require quick responses. I'm an advocate in helping athletes train cognition and being able to self-reflect in the moment, reflect on strategies, strategize, be self-aware in the moment, not all the time and not too much thinking, but I think this kind of data, this kind of feedback is so imperative for athletes of all sports.
Yeah, definitely. I think when people say, and I've worked with athletes that say, but I don't think about anything. And of course we think, because you're constantly monitoring. So for example, in endurance, you're constantly monitoring how you feel. You might not be thinking thoughts about, tomorrow or, what you're going to have for your tea, but you are thinking, explicit thoughts around how you feel, how you can persist, what speed or pace you might be going at, especially more elite runners, because they're constantly monitoring that internal kind of heart rate, pain, breathing, and that is happening regardless of whether they think they're doing it or not. Whether they remember that afterwards is a very different story. So I think a lot of athletes who've had the best race talk about this idea of flow. So I've talked a lot about flow with colleagues around we can't really use Think Aloud to access flow because people think that they're not thinking when they're experiencing flow. But I would argue that, and I have this conversation all the time, is that everyone is always thinking something at some point, and that thought process is going to have an effect on the performance outcome, which will be able to provide us with feedback to either help or improve or just become more aware of the future performance.
Amy, as an aside, have you ever heard of Barbara Gale Montero? Have you ever read her book? You need to read her book. Everybody needs to read Barbara Gale Montero, Thought in Action, where the whole book is denying the just do it principle. The just do it principle, and it's about your work talks about inaction, reflection in action, and her work is about thought in action. Someone I hope to get on the Sports Psych show. And actually there's last year a book came out about embodied cognition, which is a very posh term for basically thought processes being affected by bodily processes. And there's plenty of theories out there. I mean, Antonio Damasio's somatic mark hypothesis, basically explaining that we can't help but check in with our bodies. They're survival mechanisms. So I absolutely, over the years have had so many players, especially in the world of football, soccer, who say, well, when I'm at my best, which is a question I often ask, I'm not thinking. And it can be a sort of a challenging cul-de-sac to turn around and come back and change their reflective practice there, and change their opinion on not thinking at all, because I completely agree. self-monitoring, engaging in effort, engaging in all kinds of thought processes. I think it's. I agree with you.
I will say I've been doing a lot of reading and listening to some of Gary Klein's work on naturalistic decision making. Now, some of his work talks about kind of firefighters and pilots in certain situations where they make some really, quick, life-saving decisions. Now, they might not know why they made that decision, but they're still thinking during that decision. So they might not be able to explain to you, why. So one example is a firefighter that evacuates all of his colleagues out of the building because he senses that something really bad's going to happen. Now, we might not know why he sensed it, so that he could feel the heat on his ears. He detected something wasn't quite right. He wasn't able to articulate that whole process, but he knew something wasn't right, and he was still thinking in that moment. So that's my point, is that just because, you can't articulate exactly why you're doing what you're doing, you're still processing information, which we can still capture through Think Aloud.
Yeah, we could go down a rabbit hole here. I think that's a great example, Amy. I really do. I think it's brilliant, and I know Gary's work, and Dan Peterson and Len Zykowski talked about Gary's work in their book, and I spoke to them on the Sports Psych show. I'll look up what episode that was in a second, but I would relate that to say, again, I'm going to come back to football, soccer, but the same applies for all team invasion sports. It's a little bit like Lionel Messi and people saying, oh, he's just doing it. Yeah. He's just looking and reacting. But that process of anticipation, where he is looking, and Javi Hernandez, the ex-Barcelona midfielder, talks about this, how he spends all day thinking, all day as in all match, thinking. They're thinking the space, they're thinking the movement. So looking is thinking. They're searching for little clues, little bits of data coming off players and space, and a relationship between the two, and there's not 1,000 bits of thoughts, but there's still that anticipatory form of thinking that's going on.
Yeah.
Fascinating world. Yeah. Well, look, and if anything, I think this protocol becomes even more interesting and even more fascinating from the world of coaching. So you started with golfers and cyclists and participants in several sports. And then you started using the Thinking Aloud protocol in coaching. Tell us about that.
Yeah, definitely. So again, from some of the work I've done in golf, I got to my PhD, and sometimes a golfer would come off the course and say to me, I've become really aware of certain things I'm doing, or they would say I played really well then because I was thinking through my process. So I work on a sports coaching degree with a team of coaches, and we always talk about reflective practice and how important it is, but reflection was always seemed to get a bit of a bad reputation within coaching. People, thought reflecting after the event, it's time consuming, people don't always do it properly or effectively, and I think I kind of thought, how can we make reflection more time efficient, more impactful, and also how do we get people to reflect in the action? And obviously Think Aloud was a really kind of useful tool. Well, I thought it would be a useful tool to test. So I did a pilot project in 2015-16 with some coaches from St Helens Rugby League Club, and looked at how, or if, Think Aloud could be used as a reflection and action tool. And we found it to be really positive. So coaches would, I'll admit, the first time they used it, they found it really odd. Sometimes they would just verbalise absolutely anything and everything. One coach even told me the colour of the grass and the colour of the sky.
The grass is green, the sky is blue. Good information.
Yeah, but after kind of getting over the first apprehension and anxiety of using it, and the coaches would listen back, they found it super useful. So again, I developed this kind of Think Aloud program where I'd work with a group of coaches. They'd come to a workshop, I'd introduce them to it. I'd send them off with a dictaphone and a clip mic. They'd have a go. So I wouldn't prescribe anything that specific that I would want them to reflect on. I just wanted it to be kind of organic. I wanted them to listen back to themselves. And then they'd come to another workshop, and in the first, kind of second workshop after they'd used Think Aloud, they'd say things to me like, I can't believe how much I talk. And my language isn't effective with these young people. It's not appropriate. Or sometimes they'd say I'd ask questions, but I wouldn't even wait for an answer. I'd answer it myself. So they thought that they were kind of, doing all these great coaching things. But then if we look at the ABCs of coaching, they weren't kind of meeting these basic, fundamental coaching behaviours that we're constantly preaching about, allowing players to play without interrupting them too much. People thought they were doing that, but then when they listened back or when they were reflecting in action, they realised they were talking too much or interrupting too much. They were asking questions, but not allowing their players to think and respond to them questions. So these are some really basic kind of coaching behaviours that we're starting to become kind of more aware of, and coaches were starting to reflect on. But as we move through the program, so they'd use it again, they'd think of something more purposeful that they'd want to reflect on. So in the second time they'd use it, they'd think, right, well, these are areas that I feel like I need to develop. And by the end of the whole program, we would start to be questioning these coaches, well, where does this behaviour come from? So where do your Think Aloud and your reflections and your thoughts come from as you're coaching? So we delve a little bit deeper and ask the coaches, how were you coached? How were you developed as an athlete or a coach, or how were you taught at school? And do all of these things create who you are, and then create or lead into how you use Think Aloud and how you reflect and how you coach right now. So I guess we kind of went through a whole process of self-discovery with these coaches through the use of Think Aloud.
Well, where do I start here? And what you've just said actually about using the data to help coaches explore where their biases come from is something that a great conversation with Jennifer Lace about this on episode 92, which is well worth listening to, because we go into some detail there, and I think that's imperative. And I love the way that this reflection in action Thinking Aloud protocol enables that to, it almost acts as a platform for coaches to become more aware of not just the bias that they have, but it can act as a platform to start a conversation with a coach about where those biases come from. I mean, I just want to borrow a quote from a piece that you've written in a chapter of a book, and it's from a coach, a rugby league coach, who went through this process, and he said, in one of my sessions it made me more aware of some of my biases. I've realised that I will provide more feedback that is positive to those players who are struggling to perform at this level. They would get more attention off me and nothing but positive feedback. I realised with one individual that he would often receive constant corrective feedback off others in a bid to improve his performance. So I made an extra effort to adjust my approach and almost be more emotionally supportive. I had never consciously thought about this until I started using Think Aloud. And what's interesting actually is, if one was to read that chapter, actually this is a coach who very honestly said that even though he's very open to correction and very open to reflection, he'd always found it difficult with feedback from other coaches, because he'd only want feedback from the very best, which is understandable, which is absolutely understandable. But what he loved about Think Aloud was ultimately there's no hiding place. This is like him feeding back himself, essentially.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we talk about this a lot with the coaches that I work with, but there is an element of vulnerability with using Think Aloud, especially in a coaching context. And especially if at some point they want to share that Think Aloud. So initially when I work with coaches, I explain that, the Think Aloud audio is for them only if they only feel comfortable keeping it, to themselves. But throughout, if I'm working with a group of coaches that know each other quite well, they then start to share that audio. So one coach in particular that I worked with, he put a GoPro on, so he was capturing audio and video, and then he'd asked if he could share it with the rest of the group and allow the rest of the group to provide him with feedback. And being able to get to that level of kind of, I call it vulnerability or just openness to be critiqued, I thought was a really powerful kind of point in the program. And then that enabled other coaches to feel more comfortable to bring their audio and ask other people to listen to their audio and again provide feedback, and not even necessarily specific feedback, but just questions, just asking why. Well, why did you ask that to that player at that time, and do you think that was an appropriate thing to do, and where has that come from? So I guess and I say this in a lot of the Think Aloud work within coaches that I'm writing at the minute, it's not necessarily just the Think Aloud that provides this development. It's it's sharing the Think Aloud as well with a critical friend or with another group of coaches that you feel comfortable with, to be challenged even more than how you might challenge yourself if you just keep the Think Aloud to yourself. But I think you're right in the chapter with Craig. He shared some of that with me. So he was saying, there's I've got nowhere to hide. It's recorded, it's evidence there. So I can't deny that I speak to a player like this, or I can't deny that I do this kind of behaviour, because we've got the evidence, and I can only learn from this. I can't kind of bury my head in the sand and pretend it's not happening.
It's interesting because within that chapter, within that piece, you reference Professor Chris Cushion and how he links some forms of reflection to power, for instance, like a form of surveillance. If you've got a coach educator there, then that could, my interpretation of this is, if that coach educator is standing by me, that can actually change my behaviour, that can suppress me, that could actually give a false impression of who I am as a coach, because I might change in accordance to the person who's I perceive to be judging me. Whereas in this way, I'm allowed to, just essentially get on with my coaching, provide some feedback through the microphone, and then reflect on it later. So there's that interesting dynamic there where I don't need a coach educated there in the moment necessarily, and so I'm going to deliver more of a coaching practice in that moment that's attuned to the kind of way I coach ordinarily.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that I'm aware of at the beginning of these programs, is that I don't want the coaches that I'm working with to think that we're, surveilling their thought processes. And that's why I'm quite explicit in the beginning that if they don't want to share that, then that's absolutely fine. I think throughout, over kind of a period of weeks where they feel more comfortable and less like they're being kind of observed or surveilled, they are then more comfortable to share it. So I completely agree with Chris's work around how a lot of reflective practice is kind of, reflect afterwards, fill in this log, and it's going to be examined by a tutor or a coach educator. We're trying to move away from that, and also acknowledge that everyone is individual and every coach coaches differently. So that's why I'm really passionate about not prescribing what these coaches, think aloud and reflect about, because it's personal to them, and everyone will get something different from the end of the program and the process, but hopefully everyone is able to develop their practice in some way, shape or form.
I want to just strip this back for a few minutes, get your comment on a couple of things. So in the chapter that we're actually referring to right now, you start by talking about different forms of reflection. And we've kind of alluded to this throughout our conversation today, but there's three forms. So reflection in action, which is the Think Aloud protocol that you're using, there's reflection on action, and you talk about retrospective reflection on action. Can you just briefly take us through, as I've said, we're talking about reflection in action, and that's the Thinking Aloud protocol. So reflection on action and retrospective reflection on action, what do you mean by those two?
My meaning, which links to some of Sean's work, so obviously reflection in action is the how we're reflecting in the action, so as it's happening, and that's where Think Aloud would come in. Reflecting on the action would be kind of after it's happened. That's very kind of time dependent. And then you've got, can you be retrospective or delayed kind of reflection on action? And I think I'm not saying is that one is better than the other, but from my opinion is that, you know, by using Think Aloud to facilitate reflection in action, it can actually improve the reflection on action because we're storing more to memory. I haven't tested this, by the way, so again, this is just my opinion, but we're able to recall kind of more of how we thought and felt during the event, and the fact that we've got it recorded, we can then reflect on the action, which was in the action. I always confuse people when I say that. But it's also important that we do go away and we do kind of think about it and let it ruminate for a while, because reflection isn't just about, you know, how we reflect right there and then. We might have to go away and the penny might not drop till a day or two later, or it might never. So sometimes when we're teaching reflection or we're working with people, and this has happened to me before, you know, I did my degree and then I might not have realised something until a year later, and I go, oh, that's why we did that at that time, and that's why I've become who I am right now, or that's why I do this and this. So, you know, reflection never stops. So like for me, I think that the different modes of reflection or the different time elements of reflection kind of facilitate different things at different times, if that makes sense.
Oh, 100%. You know, I love those three forms of, or three modes, as you say, of reflection. And, you know, clearly what you're doing is you're providing coaches and players and participants with a framework for reflection in action, which most people don't have. What we've spoken about today is actually reflection on action. So that reflection after the event can be time consuming. It can also be inaccurate as well. But you know, potentially important to do if you do have the time as a coach to do it. And then that interesting piece on respective reflection on action. So when things sink in over time, okay, I am where I am, or I am who I am, or I do what I do because this happened and that happened, and that's the way I thought about that event, and so now I act in this way, or I believe this, or my values are this. So what I hear you say, all three are important, but here is a framework for reflection and action. And so stripping things back more. So what I've heard you say, if you know, I'm thinking of coaches listening out there, and they're going, this is all very nice, but I don't have a sports psych by my side here. What I hear you say is, well, that's cool. You know, you can possibly have your phone in your pocket and you can bring that out and just start reflecting in action on anything you want, anything you feel is important or useful. And then over time, actually, you might learn to filter through what you believe are the important points in every training session, that you might actually become more accomplished at reflecting in action on the most pertinent points. Would I be right in saying that could be a process for coaches to go through?
Yeah, I think it's really simple, that's one of the things that people. I deliver workshops to, you know, different NGBs, different groups of coaches, and everyone goes, yeah, that's really simple. So, and it is. I think it's what we do with that information that becomes a little bit more like kind of complex and thoughtful. But to start off with, most of the coaches I work with will use their mobile phone. They'll just use the headphones that come with that, because most of the time they have a built-in microphone, and they'll just kind of have a go. And as simple as that sounds, that would be what I would recommend. Some things to be aware of and to kind of just to highlight is let the players know that you are using Think Aloud for you as the coach, because players can then become quite self-conscious when they can see you talking into a microphone, and that's happened with some coaches that I've worked with.
You might get some strange looks as well.
Yeah, so I think it's just being quite open and honest with the people around you, players, you know, your colleagues, any co-coaches that you're working with, and also if you're coaching young children, let parents know potentially that you're using it, because again, parents are going to be looking at the coach thinking, is he gone a little bit mad? Is he stood there talking to himself? So although kind of I took these things for granted in the beginning, they are things that coaches do feel quite self-conscious about. Away from coaching, I've used it with in running myself just to test it out. And I'm personally thinking, am I getting looks at, or am I getting strange looks because I'm running down the street having a conversation? So, and I think once you've gotten over that initial kind of barrier of, this feels uncomfortable, or I'm being judged because I'm kind of mumbling away to myself, things become much, much easier. And a lot of coaches that I work with just say, it's become much more natural, it's become much more easier for me to engage and think aloud. So I always say that the first time that a coach uses it is the hardest.
And I love what you're saying about reflecting or listening to that audio data. Yes, you can do it on your own, and yes, that's going to be an enormously useful tool. But if you are at a point in your coaching life whereby you feel ready to share that with fellow coaches, with a critical friend, whoever it might be, that sounds like an enormously useful process to go through. As you said, you used the term vulnerability. I think of, within an organisation, within a coaching environment, there's a few coaches. I think of psychological safety.
Yeah.
And you use a term in this chapter which I think is so vital, so important, so interesting. A community of practice. A community of practice. Coaches all in, having conversations about the action, what's happened in the action, in the training, in the practice session.
I think it's really important that if I am working with a group of coaches that, like you said, they do feel psychologically safe. And going back to the element of power and Chris Cushion's work, sometimes it's impossible to get away from, but something that I personally work really hard on is trying to make these coaches or these people that I'm working with feel like I'm not judging them. And we're creating an environment where they're not there to judge each other, they're there to support one another. I think once we develop that, then the whole process takes care of itself, and I become kind of redundant in that process. And I know sports psychologists say your job's complete when you've become redundant, because you've set up that environment, you've given potentially provided certain skills, and then I was just able to step back, and the coaches that I work with just would support one another. They kind of ran with the Think Aloud process, and there's groups of coaches now that I know are using it in this kind of group, community of practice, or whatever you'd want to call it, and are still getting a lot out of it and developing each other through that process. Now, one of the things that I'd recommend if you're not in a group of coaches, or you haven't got a community, is just go and find one other coach, or even just someone, I say critical friends, just someone who would be able to challenge you. Because going back to Chris Cushion, some of his critique of reflective practice is that there's only so much we can reflect upon on our own. So it's important that there is somebody there to challenge us and, and check in on our thought processes, because we might be thinking that we're doing the right things, but actually someone from the outside might come along and go, have you thought about it this way or this way, and challenging certain thought processes. And I guess we don't necessarily change unless we're being challenged in that way.
Absolutely, well said, well said. Amy, what's next? What's next for the Think Aloud protocol? What have you got going on? What are you pushing through?
So for me now, it's how do we make this more applied? So, we've done a lot of research with athletes, and we know, athletes think certain ways in cycling. We know there's expertise differences in golf, and we know that thought processes change between practice and competition. So what I'm really interested in now is looking at how the coach can use that data. So how a coach could use Think Aloud with an athlete to inform their practice and their kind of work with that specific athlete. That's one kind of area that I'm interested in. Also, I'm looking at not just how the coach can use it, but how the sports psychologist can use it. And then finally, from a coach developer perspective, how can the coach developer use Think Aloud with the coach to help the coach develop even further? So what we're looking at next is the coach developer becoming the critical friend, and the coach sharing the audio with the coach developer, but again looking at how we can try and overcome this element of power and surveillance and pressure. But the coach developers that I'm working with have got a really good relationship with the coaches that we're looking to do some projects with.
So essentially, coaches, athletes, let's put the sports psychologist aside for a second, coaches and athletes working together on this, reflecting on the data that's the audio data coming through from reflection in action, and building strategies, building interventions based on what they're listening to, what they're hearing.
Yeah, 100%. You've said it better than I did.
No, not at all. I just think it's imperative, and I think that's a really interesting thing as well, because when I reflect back, and I'm going to, hey, look, I can only talk about from a participant perspective, my golfing career, and I think back going to see coaches, and I saw some great coaches, but going to, I don't know, you might call them a coaching session or a lesson that we might say in golf. I think back, and it was you go to your coaching session, and there might be an order of things in terms of how the coach has set things up, and there's a slight bias towards technique in golf, rightly or wrongly, but I reflect back and listening to what you're saying, I think, wow, how much colour and relevance and optimization there would have been within my golf sessions, my coaching sessions with my coach, if I could go back with this data on my phone. Probably when I was competing, we didn't have phones that enabled that to happen, right? But some kind of audio where we could just sit down in the 19th and just listen, a cup of tea, listen to it, and that would have been awesome, because there would have certainly been some expletives, there certainly would have been a lot of irrationality, that irrespective of how hard we were working on my golf swing, all that pales into insignificance, because we could create a great swing on a practice ground, but if I'm experiencing the kind of cognitions, the kind of affect, emotion that I was experiencing on the golf course, well, that just doesn't matter, because I couldn't actually put into practice what we were working on the practice ground anyway. So my coaching sessions would have been, I think, so much more impactful.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that, Dan. Thinking about you, reviewing say hypothetically, you'd used Think Aloud, you'd reviewed it on the 19th, thinking about, especially in competition, one of the biggest kind of limiting thought processes that I found with golfers is that they're constantly dwelling on that one shot that they missed, 4 holes, 5 holes ago, and that's massively affecting how they then play the next shot. So that is one example of an obvious way as a coach or a psychologist to go, right, well, your thought processes and your cognitions made up during this time of 90% of the thoughts from 5 shots ago. So you're wasting 90% of your cognitions on this rather than committing 100% onto the next shot that you're going to play. So again, like you've said there, it doesn't matter how good your swing is, if you're not focused and in the moment of that shot, then it's irrelevant.
No, 100%. And look, we could go as deep as you like into this, and I'm thinking about your time, but I would say that there's so much to say there, and I could stick a bad swing on a particular shot, say on the 5th tee, slices off out of bounds, and the cognition might be reflecting on it down the fairway, but it's on the next tee, if I'm getting my driver back out again, where I've potentially got a big challenge, because I've just executed a swing that I can still feel potentially. I can still feel, and this is where what I like about this is I talked to Steve Magnus about this in where are we, episode number 84 of the Sports Psych Show, is that science doesn't do very well, science isn't very good with feelings. Science isn't very good with feelings, and you've chuckled there because I'm guessing that is because you agree with that, and that's a problem. And when I say feelings, that might be it does better with things like affect, but almost kinesthetic feelings as well, almost but also feelings. It's how I'm feeling in the moment, and it's not just the emotion. I'm perhaps struggling to articulate myself here, but it's not just the affect feeling, and it's not just the kinesthetic feeling. It's the feeling of the golf swing I've made and the feelings I experience as a consequence of that. And I stand on that 6th tee, having cut it out of bounds on the last, like it's gone sideways right. And that's now, I'm not going to say it's a problem, but it's a real challenge I've got to be able to deal with that. I've now got to be able to execute a motion where I've got to not care that I've cut it, and that's not easy to do. That these are the kind of unseen things that say golfers have to deal with. But if I think of tennis, I think of if I've had a particularly bad service game, and I go to my next service game, and my body feels out of rhythm, out of whack. I feel that I'm not releasing the racket through the ball, or whatever it is that tennis players might have to feel. Problem. Now, let's bring this back to think aloud. This, to me, is where it's so important for athletes and coaches to have these kind of conversations, to note this data, to have these conversations, to come up with impactful strategies to be able to deal with that. Because we can, coming back to golf, we can work on swing all we want, but if we can't deal with the sliced swing on the 5th effectively, to go onto the 6th tee and then to be able to release through the ball hard, to send it down the left side of the fairway, cutting into the middle of the fairway, I'm getting very technical now, but that's a problem, and that kills careers. That means somebody wins on tour £50,000, loses their tour card rather than £500,000. It means somebody's career doesn't get started in the first place. It means an amateur plays off 10 rather than 7. It means the beginner golfer actually doesn't enjoy it as much and actually gives up rather than keeps on going. So, sorry, I've gone off on one there. That's where I think it's effective.
I'm inclined to agree.
Lovely, nicely succinct. Brilliant. Okay. Well, fantastic. I really enjoyed that, Amy. I think that was great. Look, I'm sure you've tapped the interest of a lot of people listening in. So how can people get in touch? Have you got social media? If you want to be found, how can you be found?
Yeah, so Twitter at @A_Whitehead1. Always open to being contacted via Twitter. I've also got Think Aloud Research and Practice Twitter page, which kind of has all the applied work and also research that I do in and around Think Aloud. So that's at Think Aloud UK on Twitter. Also happy for people to contact me via email, a.e.whitehead@ljmu.ac.uk, or just Google Amy Whitehead LJMU, and you'll get my kind of work and research profile on there. So yeah, definitely if anyone's interested or wants to know more or wants access to some of the research that we've done, more than happy for them to get in touch.
Perfect. Brilliant. Amy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the good conversation, and hopefully we've kind of given a few ideas and thoughts to coaches and sports psychologists out there.
I think we definitely have. Well, everyone, that was Dr. Amy Whitehead, and wasn't that absolutely fantastic? I really enjoyed my conversation with Amy there. And I hope you did too. If you did, please get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Psych show, and if you do have any feedback or suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.